Thanks for coming back on the show, Mr. Shanker. It is wonderful to have you. Last time we did chat, it was 2023, and it was soon after your book, Age of Danger, was published. The full title is Age of Danger Keeping America Safe in an Era of New Superpowers, New Weapons, and New Threats. And your co author, Andrew Hone, you guys made some pretty prescient calls. And I thought it would be a really cool way to start a conversation by diving a little bit back into what you guys framed as the action systems and the warning systems is how you framed our military intelligence. And why don't we just start with that?
Joey, always an honor to speak with you. It's a absolutely fantastic podcast. And I like to joke that my writing partner, Andy Hohen of Rand, he's the brains of the outfit. And I just did the legwork, somewhat handy with the vocabulary. But Andy and I've known him for 20 years almost. And just over that time, we began looking at is it possible that this country can spend $1 trillion a year on defense, security, et cetera, yet people still don't feel safe? And we kind of came down to two major problems that we wrestled with in Age of Danger. One is a question of definitions. How you define a problem defines the solution and very often limits them. And that applies to how the threat from Iran has been described and acted upon. And the other piece is just as you said, we looked at the warning machine and the action machine. And how is it that sometimes the warning is very accurate about a threat, but the action's not taken because our political leadership, their inbox is always full, or there's no appetite, or an election's coming, or just today is too damn busy to deal with some major problem. And for a lot of the problems that we describe, the impact of extreme weather, the rise of drones, some of the health crises, food crises, the action machine's not even in place right now. And you can see that all of this applies to the Iran scenario today.
Wow. Okay. Can you start with that? The focal point of this discussion is going to be Iran and what we did there and why we did it. And obviously, I think I've been talking with a lot of my sources on this for the last, I think, 15 days or however long we've been at war. Or I'm sorry, it's an excursion. We go by Mr. Trump's delineation. But the idea there is that there's a lot of discussion specific to the lack of communication from the administration. So the idea originally was that there was enriched uranium. There's a possibility of Iran having nuclear capabilities within weeks or months, which is part of the intelligence discussion anyway. There's also regime change that Trump has thrown forward, saying, hey, we need to change this regime because it's a theocracy that has been in place for 50 years and it's a big problem. There's also the idea beyond the cultural and political pieces, but none of those have been cemented in any specific public relations from anyone in the administration. How do you see this war? How do you define this war and the warning system side of things? What is it that the warning system told our administration or the Israelis that we need to attack now?
That's an absolutely fantastic question. It's fundamental. Some of the nation's most senior intelligence officials testified before Congress, and they got wrapped around the axle of their own vocabulary because Trump and Rubio and Hegseth have said, Joey, just what you said. It's about the race for nuclear weapons in Iran, it's their ballistic missile capability, et cetera. But the intelligence officials couldn't provide any information that things were so different 15 days ago than they were a year ago, or might have been 6 months or a year from now. In fact, it's so interesting that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, even said perhaps the main reason we attacked is because we knew Israel was going to, and so therefore we had to join this preemptive war of choice. And Rubio got pulled back and he tried to walk away from his own statement. And then just in recent days, Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned because he thought, here's one of the top counterterrorism officials in the Trump administration. He said, one, Iran was not an imminent threat. The intelligence didn't have that warning. And two, he felt that it was a wag the dog where Israel's actions and lobbying and convincing had Trump join a campaign that was not in this nation's interest. So the whole warning and action machine frankly, Joey, is extremely confused and extremely fuzzy. I teach a master's course in media and national security. One of the first things we do, we watch Colin Powell's entire speech to the UN in February 2003, where he made the case for going to war with Iraq. We now know the intel was bad. The warning machine wasn't correct, but it's important because even if you can put aside the strategic failure of the invasion, the Bush administration, bless its heart, thought it was important to make the case to the world and to the American people thoroughly and with its most respected cabinet member making the case. Compare that to what the Trump administration has done, which, as you so correctly point out, is completely fuzzy and unclear as far as what the warning was that prompted, let's call it what it is, a war. It's not a military excursion, it's not a contingency. The US and Israel went to war with Iran.
Correct, and that's a lot of the things that I'm seeing too, just in my own homework on this specific to Israel, that Bibi has said this to leaders for decades, all the way, I think, back to George W. Herbert Walker Bush, Clinton, Obama. And that's the one thing I think we even discussed this briefly in our last chat, even on camera, was that Iran has always been a hot box, a Pandora's box, a big problem for many reasons. And that what took place specific with the Israeli intelligence saying, hey, we know that this is happening and we're gonna strike and then you're gonna help us and it's gonna make everything great. They did talk Trump into that, according to a lot of things I'm seeing behind the scenes. But was there any, and this was specific to the warning systems again, I, as a layperson, have probably done maybe 150 hours of research on this, talking to sources I have and reading as much as I can about the history.
We'll call you Dr. Dumont then if you've done that much work.
Well, yeah, and share that not to impress, but to impress upon folks that I don't know a lot about war. So I wanted to study on this because I wanted to talk to you and other people I have coming on the show. But the idea around Strait of Hormuz, as an example, seems to be one of those things where this is not new information, right? So did the warning systems detach at some level? Because what I've read specifically with Secretary Hegseth is that we knew that our allies, in this case, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and a couple others, may at some point be attacked. We didn't anticipate that they'd be attacked immediately. That was one thing they said. The other was that we anticipated that economic sanctions or economic pressure would start to hit, meaning that the Straits of Hormuz may be at some point overseen by Iran or anyone in the allies there. And we knew that was going to be a problem, but they didn't anticipate it being a problem as early on. I just, even as a layperson, I'm gobsmacked at the level of ignorance or the level of disconnect from just the historical realities of war, specifically with that of Iran.
Right. I certainly wish you were in the situation room for the discussions because what you just said, Joey, is completely true. Again, I spent 15 years as the New York Times Pentagon correspondent, starting in 2001 before 9/11 and ending deep in 2015. So I spent so much time in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Persian Gulf, and when I was in the Gulf in Bahrain, where the Fifth Fleet is based, at the air base Al Udeid in Qatar, the largest Air Force base in the region, and talking to the intel officers, they all knew that if Iran were to be attacked severely, they would close the Strait of Hormuz, the pathway for 20% of the world's oil and gas, and by the way, much of the world's food fertilizer. So there'll be a follow-on impact on food as well as cars and air travel and all that. I don't know what Trump was briefed. None of us do. We don't know what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, what the CENTCOM commander told him, but I guarantee there are books on the wall, volumes of them, in the Joint Staff, in Central Command, laying out what Iran was likely to do. And if it's not number one, it's number two or three. It's close the Strait of Hormuz. So for anybody, Joey, to expect surprise is beyond surprising. You use the word gobsmacked. I have other words I could use, but let's throw the red flag on this because they knew that this was a very high possibility. And there are also planning documents. We've all been briefed, we've all reported on what the US can and can't do to reopen the strait. Are there ways to do it? Yes, but a senior admiral in Bahrain once said to me, if the US has to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to be like a knife fight in a phone booth. The bigger guy with the bigger weapons may not have the advantage because it's a close quarters fight, and that little shiv may do all the damage it has to do, even if you're carrying a big machine gun. I apologize for taking the analogy too far, but the Strait of Hormuz is this skinny place. The US Navy operates much better in big open waters where our eyes and ears and jets and missiles can dominate. It's terrible. And also, this sort of myth that we didn't expect for Iran to keep fighting. Iran, the military, the intelligence community, the warning machine has known forever that if the Iranian leadership were to be decapitated, the IRGC, the main military force, has distributed headquarters all across the country. Their command and control knows what to do if after 48 hours they haven't gotten commands from higher headquarters, if it's known that their leaders are dead. They know how to keep the fight going. It becomes a national, almost insurgency. And so to say, oh, we didn't know they would keep lobbing drones at Dubai and at the Emirates and all of that, even after the leadership was killed, the warning machine warned it, but I guess they didn't convince the leadership.
You're right, and that's another thing too. There's so many parallels, and we talked about this last time. The parallels between Vietnam. I mentioned The Fog of War because I love that movie, and that's where Bob McNamara was interviewed. Here's the 11 things we never want to do again in time of war. We're doing all of them again. And the idea there is that if you look at the culture of Iran and what you just mentioned, they call it the mosaic defense, right? So they have this whole system set up that's decentralized. So if you take out the heads of every single area, you go after all of them, they will know exactly what to do. They will replace someone else. And I watched an interview with the foreign minister yesterday, and he said very similar things to Ho Chi Minh in the sense that you guys don't understand who we are. And I don't mean we, in this case, it's the Trump administration. I think that anyone of your acumen or anyone else that understands this at an expertise level would say, yeah, we understand that this culture is different. This is a theocracy. This is a existential threat. You have now violated their life and their culture and their belief systems, and they're not going to stop. They're going to come at us. And I think now they know they can't match us kinetically specific for war. So they're like, "Hey, let's do the asymmetric war that worked really well in Vietnam. America won every single battle and lost that war." And it's the same kind of thing here where if we're launching $2 million missiles against $20,000 drones, they're like, we'll do that all day long. Even Zelensky was doing that very well against Putin. So you're like, the idea there around the culture, how is that? Like you've covered wars for decades. How this doesn't seem to be different in that we didn't understand the culture of a regime that we say we want to replace. That's the biggest question to me. When you look at Trump coming up after, again, a brilliant military execution, I don't think anyone of reason debates that what we do militarily is wonderful and efficient and obviously very destructive. But what do you do after? Because then this is a guy named Richard Pape. I don't know if I'm sure you've seen him, and he's the professor at University of Chicago that talks about the escalation trap, and we're now in it. So what do we do now with the Straits of Hormuz being basically shut down for us and Israel? Historically, and you know this better than I, the next step, according to everything I've read, is that one of the options is boots on the ground. And it's not a lot, it's not like a special ops group that we're going to do in stealth in the middle of the night. This is Marines in the Straits of Hormuz that we have to get through the straits, which you just mentioned is a narrow passage. It's 21 miles at its narrowest point. It's got a whole bunch of aqueducts. It's got different pieces, possibly 6,000 mines that they can lay in there. They have warriors. They have the Israeli Revolutionary Guard has speedboats that they launch their missions on, and they have all these different warriors ready. This is a quagmire, right? This is huge. How is it that we're going to get out of this escalation trap? And Sean, put that in our show notes.
Okay.
The escalation trap for our audience, Professor Richard Pape has a Substack called The Escalation Trap, and it's brilliant. And it really helped me understand where we are in this war. We are now in a trap, correct? What are we going to do? What are we going to do?
So these are you asked half dozen great questions. Let me go through them. I like to say that everything in sorry?
So I rambled a little bit there.
No, it was wonderful. I was with you every step of the way, I promise. I like to say that everything important in life I learned from 3 sources: my wife, Johnny Cash, and the United States Army. And what the Army taught me is when you have a colossal problem, divided into the workable pieces: tactical, operational, strategic. And as you said, Joey, the military has executed a near perfect tactical operation. Tragedy, of course, that a cruise missile hit a school, killed a bunch of kids. That's an absolute heartbreaking tragedy. But if you look overall, the American military is probably the greatest in the history of the world. They can really do the job. Operationally, it all fit together. Decapitate the leadership, go after the missiles, try to as many of the mine-laying boats, etc. But the strategic piece, Joey, that's what's missing here. What was the overall strategy? What was the desired end state that was reasonable? You decapitate the leadership, you want the people to come on the streets and take over. That's a perfectly fine hope, but hope is not a strategy. What was the realistic strategy here? You've talked very articulately about the character of the Iranian people. And what most Americans forget is that Persia is a proud and ancient country with a great history. It beat the ancient Greeks, which was no small feat. So to expect them just to roll over and say, "Come on in, America, we're yours," is just not realistic, even among those who may very much dislike the theocracy. They are still proud Iranian, proud Persian people. And the more we blow up their country, the more we risk losing even those who don't like the theocracy, because they will fail to see a strategy other than they want to blow us up and take the oil. And that gets us to your final point, which is the oil depot on Harg Island. There's been lots of talk. Who knows if it's bluster? Who knows if it's deterrence? About 2,500 Marines were just dispatched to the area. Those Marines, a Marine hit the beach. They
Yeah.
know how to do that and they are expert at it. But Joey, then what? I mean, so they right,
I did.
we have to then dig it.
Right? Yeah.
Right, taking it is one thing,
But
holding it, defending it, having it make sense is something else entirely. So, I don't see a clear strategy here.
I don't either. And I think that the boots on the ground is part of the escalation trap. So once the military acumen is proven, you're like, great, we're powerful, we're badass. No one wants to take us on kinetically. Got it. The bigger issue, and this started with the June War, when they say they decapitated not only the some of the leaders, but they took out some of the nuclear munitions that they needed. Specifically, some of the. I think it was really about what do we do with the uranium? Like we now know they have uranium. They say they have 400 whatever. I can't remember the term that they use, but they have a certain amount of uranium. If it's there, and we blew up the nuclear facility around it, how do we know what they did? Because we did see afterwards for satellite footage that they're moving things out. So a lot of the experts are saying that's probably it's the unenriched uranium, but it's uranium that they're going to eventually get to. And once they have these in the centrifuges, that they can eventually get to the isotope 238, which actually makes it work, and all those neat things. But is that another issue that we are stuck in specific to the escalation trap? Is that if we want to remove their nuclear power, we can't do it from the air. We need boots on the ground to not only go out and do what we were just talking about with the island of Card, but what are we gonna do with the uranium? We have to go in and get that too, no?
Right, that's a real problem. Us civilians don't have any clear idea of whether the uranium is still in its vials, buried beneath rubble, whether the Iranians were able to remove it. I'm sure we had eyes overhead on that site. We might have seen some working, but my sense, again, just a guess, that if we really thought they were excavating and removing, we would have hit them again with long range precision strike. So maybe they got it all out, or maybe it's still buried underground. But even if it's buried underground, if Iran had a concerted effort to dig it out and get it out, that's a concern. But what? We're gonna land a Marine Expeditionary Force with backhoes and drills and spend 6 weeks on the ground in Iran digging out a hole of rubble that we made in June with our bombing and get all this stuff out. Look, think about the raid on bin Laden's compound, Abbottabad. That was a matter of minutes, and we still lost a helicopter. It still could have gone upside down. I just don't know how you land a force there with sufficient equipment and time to excavate and bring the stuff out when we're on hostile territory. It would have to be regime change would have to be complete to do that.
That almost seems like it's not gonna happen. I don't know enough about it because maybe they'll go and kill Mojaba at this point, right? The new Khomeini, but Junior, as they say. So you have, and that's another thing too, just The Godfather taught us many lessons in that movie, right? One of which is you gotta kill the kid if you kill the parents, right? Because he's gonna live his life coming after you. And I've said this in joking with my producer and everyone else, is if someone killed my wife and my son and my relatives and threatened to continue to come after me, and I was handed the help, I know what I would do. I would There would be a lot of revenge in my blood, and it's probably not the most healthy and probably not even something I should admit, but I think Moshaba Khomeini is, and what I've read about him too, is even more radicalized than his father. He was and is part of the IRGC. They loved him. He grew up in that environment. He was a cleric as well, so he has a lot of good reputational issues specific to his theocracy and who he believes and what the culture believes. Because he has this attachment to the IRGC, they trust him. He trusts them. That's 200,000 basically Spartans in this sense, right? Where these are very highly trained officers that have an allegiance to the leader, which in this case, another thing that no one wants to talk about, and maybe my numbers are wrong, but you can correct me. I've read they have about 1 million soldiers. So when Donald Trump gets up on the microphone and says that they've basically taken out Iran's, we did take out the Navy, kudos. We did take out some of their issues with our military, but he didn't mention forever, and no one has, even Pete Hegseth has never mentioned this. Don't they have 1 million soldiers? They have 200,000 IRGC, they have 600,000 in the military, and they have 300 plus thousand reserves, correct?
Well, I don't know what the numbers are, but the analogy again back to Iraq makes sense. Even though the Ba'athist army under Saddam was disbanded, you have a lot of angry men of fighting age who have guns. So, Joey, I don't know if there's a countable million men in a formal army, but I guarantee there are 1 million people who don't want the U.S. doing this. And they have access to weapons. So it's and moving from Iraq to Afghanistan, the Taliban won the war. And the joke was always, we have all the watches, they have all the time. And I think that sort of applies to Iran as well. We may have all the watches, but they have the time. They've got drones. And so I just don't see a quick end to this, which is why the escalation trap analogy is very smart.
Yeah, I know my producer just helped me with this. They have 350,000 reserves, so they're not active military, but 600,000 active, 200,000 in the IRGC. So a formidable military.
But even those reserves have been trained. They have
Yes.
access to weapons. So again, I'm not disputing the number of 1 million.
No, I was just
All I'm saying is the
to myself.
a civilian militia, when mobilized, can do a lot of damage. Like
Yes.
during the Iraqi civil war that prompted the surge in 2006 when we basically invaded the country for the second time because all of these angry Baathists who weren't in the army anymore, they became militiamen and they were just as lethal. That could happen in Iran. So your overall point, Joey's exactly right.
Yeah. You mentioned Joe Kent earlier. I didn't know who he was up until a couple days ago when he resigned. I think I read about his confirmation or Trump's choosing him. He is a Trump loyalist, and he has always been a big Trump supporter. He even tried to peddle the lies of the 2020 election being a fraud. I looked into his background because there's a lot of accusations about him being anti-Semitic and full of conspiratorial theories and his wife in Syria and all of those things. But I don't see anything about his background that would remove what he just did and what he just said in writing, because his resignation was, I thought, very clear and sober. He wasn't going after President Trump because I'm calling names. He wasn't naming names. He was just saying, hey, you ran in 2016 and 2020 and 2024 by recognizing that attacks in the Middle East, the forever wars, is a bad idea. And maybe through the lens of economics, because obviously Mr. Trump cares about money. So if you think that was the case, what was this change? If what do you think that was? Because that was Joe Kent. And by the way, I watched him with Tucker Carlson's interview. And if there's anything that's changed in my life the last couple months, is that I'm now watching Tucker Carlson because he's actually making sense for the first time in a bit specific to this war. And there was a very long form interview with Joe Kent. And he basically said, I don't understand what took place with the Donald Trump that I know and love and support. What do you think it is? What do you think? Was it Bibi? Was it Jared Kushner, as they say, to convince him? I mean, how do you go from thinking that he knows, he knew this, but Mr. Trump knew that this was going to be a terrible thing if it didn't go perfectly. And it did go almost perfectly since the school tragedy. And it's now, what are you going to know? He doesn't know. Change his mind.
But again, that's the mismatch between tactics, operations, and strategy. Trump, I'm sure, was briefed on the what could go wrong, and that's exactly what's happening now. If you're watching Tucker Carlson for us, you're like those medieval food tasters who had to eat the king's dinner before the king did to make sure it wasn't poisoned. So thank you for watching Tucker Carlson. For the rest of us, Joey, and don't let your mind be poisoned, okay?
And well, I'm not a fan of Tucker Carlson. Let me say that out loud. But I this interview was astute because it was a 2-hour interview and he spent all day, 24 hours with Joe Kent. So I was like, I gotta figure out who this Joe Kent guy is. Yeah. And the fact that anyone at that level, specifically with top level clearance, everything that anyone knew specific to intelligence, Joe Kent knew.
Exactly right. And again, let me just all joking aside, I'm an absolutist when it comes to the First Amendment. So I would defend Tucker Carlson's show. I defend MSNBC. So it's great. To your very specific point, this guy had access to the crown jewels of American intelligence every morning. He had the keys to the warning machine, right? Because the National Counterterrorism Center gathers all this intelligence, scrubs it, and analyzes it looking for potential terrorist attacks. So when he said that Iran was not an imminent threat, he knew from the intel that was, to his mind, true. His comments about Israel strong arming Trump or playing him or whatever, I can see why some of those who look at his past anti Semitic statements might say, oh, he's trying to blame Israel or Kushner or whomever for pulling Trump into this war. But I'm reminded of a joke I made. My wife always says that I never let a promising career stand in the way of a good joke. And when I was covering Rumsfeld, the bad Rumsfeld, the first Rumsfeld was great. Second Rumsfeld was bad. I used to always open speeches by saying, just because Don Rumsfeld says something doesn't automatically make it wrong. And so just because Joe Kent has a history of conspiratorial thoughts and some say anti-Semitism, I
Yeah.
can't judge that. That doesn't make his assessment in his farewell message wrong. And
And that's why I tried to figure out what did he say that could actually disengage anyone from listening to his expertise, and there wasn't enough there. To your point, even if he was an anti-Semite, fine, then he's a jackass and he's a racist and whatever, fine, but is this true? An imminent threat, which he even said is just it means immediacy. It means immediate. It's gonna happen. And I think it was one of the senators, I don't know if it was Tom Cotton or Tom Tillis. Someone said it can't be an imminent threat for 47 years.
well,
Right.
exactly right, and that goes to the central thesis of my book with Andy Hohen, Age of Danger. How you define a problem defines the solutions and limits them, and at 9/11, we defined terrorism as an existential threat, even though terrorism could never destroy the existence of our nation. We did all these things that we shouldn't have. Now we know that. Same by declaring Iran an imminent threat when, according to Joe Kent and others, it wasn't. Even Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, she was really pressed hard about, was it imminent? Was it not? What did the intelligence community say? What did the warning machine say? And the director of national intelligence told Congress, it's really not my job to issue the warning. It's up to President Trump. So she seemed to have outsourced the warning process. The decision is Trump's as commander in chief. But for 50 years, the intelligence community has written and shaped with cold, clear eyes what the risk is and the warning. And now she's saying, no, it's all up to the president.
I watched that hearing because it was Senator Ossoff who was interviewing her, and she said, "This is not." He said, "No, it's precisely your job," right? So you're like that. Okay, so we now have the director of national intelligence basically poo-pooing what Joe Kent said. Joe Kent was the man in charge, like you said, had every piece of information available to him every single morning. And as a Trumper, I think the bigger piece to the Joe Kent resignation is that he loved Donald Trump. Even in the interview with the Tucker Carlson, he praised him as being a great leader and being powerful. And the fact that other nations are scared of us is because of Donald Trump's military might and the fact that he himself is aggressive and macho. And I'm paraphrasing now, but the idea there is that this is not someone that is coming out to reinvent himself to be a Fox News correspondent. He doesn't know what he's going to do for a living. That was part of the interview. He's, I just, this just happened. This was an immediate thing for me. It was a red line for me. I'm done. And it had to do with, because obviously this red line with everyone, this was his. But I think one of these things where, based on your background, question I have for you, is this the scenario that keeps military planners up at night? Where we are today, right now?
So the military never wants to get into a situation where the other side can control the escalation.
Yes.
And that seems to be where we are now, Joey, because it's up to Iran whether it keeps tossing drones at the oil rich capitals in the Gulf or doesn't toss the drones. It's up to Iran whether they turn on all of their sleeper cells in Western Europe and maybe even in the US to start, no kidding, mass casualty terror attacks. It's up to Iran whether they decide to stop throwing missiles at tankers so they can reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The American military, $800 billion, 1.3 million active duty, the greatest armada in the history of the world, is now basically letting a tiny dance partner lead on the dance floor, and the military never wants to be there.
No, and I think that extends to the sleeper cell stuff scares me. My children ask me that because they know I do this for a living now. They're 12 and 14, so they're paying attention. And my 12-year-old said, "Say, Daddy, they're going to bomb us." Because my friend said they're going to bomb us in California, meaning these sleeper cells, these terrorist cells. That is everywhere. That's global. And they have them everywhere. And I think that people misunderstand a military action like the one in Venezuela, where we went in swiftly in the dead of the night and took over Nicolas Maduro and put him in a New York prison. Oh, it's very impressive. But what is Venezuela going to do to us? I mean, nothing. They can't hurt us. Iran has 92 million people and connections all over the Middle East, all over the world. And to your point, sleeper cells, these are things that they're scary, right? In that sense. And so you're like, what is, to your point, if they're actually Iran is in charge now of escalating or de-escalating. We, as American military, never want to be in that situation. I think everyone agrees on that. So, what does it look like for us as far as off ramps? Donald Trump is saying things like, "We won the war now." He's like workshopping this, right? Which he always says, "We're doing this, and we won the war." So, whatever else happens now, it was going to happen anyway. And now they're going to rebuild these missiles, and you're mad at me for starting this war, and now we're going to have a nuclear weapon in 6 months. We're all going to die. Who knows what he's going to say? But how does he combat his own military intelligence? And maybe it's a good way to talk about this too. What about NATO? What about our allies? What about the fact that we didn't involve any of them in this war? We didn't prepare in any capacity to have our naval ships close to the Strait of Hormuz, which we may or may not need to be escorting tankers and others through for our fertilizer, oil, and our supplies. How is it that we're going to recover from this? I'm genuinely perplexed as to what we do now. Let's start with the sleeper cells. What do we do? What does that look like?
Right, so not just sleeper cells, but self-radicalized lone wolves, which actually are even harder to find in advance, they might do less damage. Although, you know what? A lone wolf with an automatic weapon, even if they kill only one person, any death above 0 is too many. So I don't wanna say that the lone wolves are not as vicious or as lethal, but sleeper cells do have planning, access to munitions, and all of that. This is where law enforcement and domestic intelligence comes into play, not just here, but all around the world in Europe and elsewhere. And as far as how this ends, Joey, that's now the question. There's a fundamental understanding, it seems, not just in this administration, but going back to Bush and Iraq and Afghanistan, the American military cannot win a war. Let me just say what I'm meaning here. The American military is designed to beat the crap out of other militaries and to beat them into submission, but that does not win the war. So when I say the US military can't win wars, I'm not critical. That's not their job. Winning wars requires politicians, leaders, diplomacy, right?
Yes.
We didn't really win World War II until the Marshall Plan. We didn't really win World War II until Japan was rebuilt, and that's why we never won in Afghanistan. We didn't win in Iraq, and so not even winning in Iran, but ending this will require mature adults to take a breath, sit around a table, and say, "Okay, Iran, what do you require?" And that's going to be sovereignty, respect for a great nation with a great history, and some sort of guarantee that the US is not gonna bomb the crap out of them every time a US president feels an imminent threat. And from our side and our allies, the Israelis, it has to be some sort of commitment to never build nuclear weapons with some realistic inspection and oversight. So there is a way forward. I spent 5 years as Moscow bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune, a time that my wife recalls as 5 winters, but that's a different story. And in my last interview with Mikhail Gorbachev, I asked him, "How was it that you and Reagan were so successful at ending the Cold War? Nuclear standoff lasted 50 years." And he said, "I always remembered that for a negotiation to be successful, both sides have to feel they've won something."
Yeah.
And so if Trump sticks with this absolutist agenda where we win everything and you go pound sand, like maybe a bad analogy in the Middle East, we win everything, you get nothing,
Yeah.
Joey, this war is not gonna end on terms that will be stable. We have to let Iran win at some essential pieces of its own sovereignty and respect, but with guarantees that it won't be a threat.
So there's a lot of discussion too about the original Iranian agreement with Obama. And people were saying that we trusted them more than we should have, that it's an Islamic radicalist jihadist, if you will, that is in charge at the time. And so can you trust them? And what did we have specific to that agreement that made you feel good as an expert in this area? And what a part of that agreement did you feel was lacking?
So again, I'm not an expert on the JCPOA, but what it tried to do, it's a little bit of an analogy like traffic at rush hour. The JCPOA didn't end Iranian nuclear weapons forever, but it's
Oh,
had safeguards in effect that put weaponization at least a year off. And every day, it was still a year off. So a month from now, it would be a year off. 6 months from now, it would still be a year off from that 6 months. And a year from now, guess what? It would still be a year off after that. So Iran kept the potential, it had its self-respect, but they were always a year away from a bomb, at least, depending on which intelligence you watch. So how many years could we have lived with them always being a year off? We could have lived a decade or more with them always being a year off. And but for some people and the Israelis in particular, and I guess Donald Trump, that guarantee was not enough because they somehow, as you said, feared breakout, feared cheating, feared a rush to a bomb in less time.
okay. So I don't know if this applies to the action system or not, but I want to get your take on Trump because a lot of things, specifically in our media landscape today, most of my sources on the left categorize this war as illegal and that's because it's part of it, specifically around the War Powers Resolution and Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, specific to the presidency and what he can do and what kind of powers he has. All of those discussions are just extraneous. We all know Obama did the same thing. W did the same thing. The last time we actually had a war that was done in the proper area isn't much of a discussion specifically today, but we didn't, as a country, involve anyone in NATO. We didn't talk to anyone. There was so many externalities to this war, specific to our allies. So if you look at Japan and you look at South Korea, how they get their oil, if you look at what's happening in Europe, right? We didn't talk to Mertz, we didn't talk to Steiner, we didn't talk to anyone about what we were doing. And then after we go in and we realize, even as a superpower, oh man, we might need some help. And then Trump does this thing. We don't need your help, Kurt Kier. So we already won the war, his little tweets and his little tantrums. And then comes back and Kier's like, hey, you can have a couple of our boats. And he's like, no, we don't need him anymore. And then he's okay. And then Trump turns around to his team and they're like, dude, we need the boats. What did we do wrong at that level? Specifically, what there was no back channel, and again, I don't have a lot of intelligence on this, but there was no back channel communications at all with any of our NATO allies. They were not involved in any of this. They were not warned. And then we brought them in and started criticizing them because they weren't helping us. And they're ungrateful. Pete Hegseth is asking everyone to thank Mr. Trump, just like J.D. Vance did against Zelensky. I don't know why I don't know why everyone in the sycophantic party wants people to thank Trump all the time, but that's what they're asking for, right? Is that we want you to thank us. Could we have blown it worse at a macro level specific to NATO?
As far as NATO, worse or not worse, it's just horrible. Trump's bullying, to put credit where credit's due, has gotten NATO to up its contributions to defense. That's a good thing.
He's not getting more money from NATO. So, like, he does certain things well, right?
That's
But
and this goes back to our conversation about Tulsi Gabbard identifying Trump not just as commander in chief, but warning officer in chief. I would only hope, Joey, that the intel that we talked about, the decades of military planning that predicted what Iran would do to defend itself and in the Strait, I hope Trump was briefed on that. But what seems to have happened, assuming he was briefed, which we have to hope, was that he said, not going to happen. My gut tells me, nah, this will be a cakewalk. And I know that we're all creatures of our history, but because I covered both the Afghan and the Iraq invasions, Afghanistan, the victory from October '01 through February of '02, when the Taliban was routed, Al Qaeda was routed, we had won the war. I think that taught Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz that we can do regime change really easily, and that led them to Iraq, even though there's no comparison. I think Trump's experience in Venezuela, which, as you said, stealth of night, they got Maduro out. I think that said to Trump, my great military, and the military is great, can do the same thing in Iran, but they're completely different scenarios, different countries, different histories. So I think Trump actually didn't think he needed allies. I think he believed, or the evidence would suggest from his behavior and statements, that he thought this would be easy. And I know that he was just speaking to the Japanese prime minister in the Oval Office, and he was asked specifically, why didn't you tell the allies? Why didn't you prepare the Europeans? He asked the Joey Dumont question, the one you just asked. And Trump said, I'm here with the Japanese prime minister. They know a little bit about surprise. Why didn't you tell us about Pearl Harbor? And it was a stunning, undiplomatic moment, except credit to the Japanese prime minister. Other than her eyes getting a little wide, she took a deep breath, as smart politicians do, and then her face returned to the mask of diplomacy.
President Donald Trump referenced Japan's 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor today while discussing recent U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. His comments came during a meeting at the White House with Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi.
When we go in, we went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay?
we watched it this morning and it was my producer and I just laughing out loud. We're like, wow. Because he did the same thing the other day talking about how he was going to take Cuba. And Peter Ducey from Fox News like, take? Like, What do you take? Like, he said, I could take it, we could play with it, we could do whatever we want. I can do whatever I want. And you're like, oh my God. It's just these moments where the lack of history, I think with General Kane specifically, from everything I've read about his tenure, his expertise, there's no way he doesn't know this. But to your point, I never thought he may not have briefed him because maybe Trump didn't want the brief.
So we won't know that. And again, just to compliment the military, everything General Kane seems like an absolutely outstanding chairman, competent, smart. He's really, and in fact, his messaging to the American people in the world, I think, is what the American people deserve. I think he's the only one who's really messaging within his space. And I don't mean to demean it by messaging advertising, but he's the only one who's explaining the war to the American people who deserves an explanation. We won't know, maybe historians or maybe my colleagues, the Times where I used to work, will dig this out. Joey, I would be surprised if Trump and his war cabinet weren't briefed on the things that we've been discussing. It would be, I don't want to say dereliction of duty, that's no fair, but I can't imagine that they didn't say Goldilocks. Here's the 3 bowls of porridge, here are the 3 beds, small, medium, large, Mr. President. I just hope and pray that Trump at least was briefed on the things that we've been talking about, and that he then made a conscious decision, however wrong, to ignore them. Because if they didn't brief him, then the warning machine is broken and not just the action machine.
And that's a good pivot to something you talked about in our first chat together. You, in your book, Age of Danger, talked about the Zoom effect. Can you explain to our listeners what that is, why that is probably very important for today's discussion?
Yeah, it really is. After 9/11, the entire $1 trillion national security, defense, law enforcement machine zoomed in on counterterrorism. And again, I was on my way to my desk at the Pentagon on 9/11. I knew people who died at the Pentagon. 3,000 Americans perished because of a vile terrorist act. I'm not saying it wasn't a horrible attack on our nation, but the zoom on counterterrorism, defining it as an existential threat, which means can destroy the existence of our nation. Al Qaeda on its best day could not destroy the existence of America. But this zoom prompted us to spend money, start 2 wars, do things that some Americans aren't proud of. And that upon reflection, we see, and there's wide agreement, were strategic mistakes. The Council on Foreign Relations just declared the invasion of Iraq as one of the greatest, or maybe the greatest strategic mistake in modern American history. And that zoom, not only did it overemphasize a threat beyond reality, but it blinded us to a whole host of other challenges that are now rearing their head. China. My co-author, Andy Hohen, was a top strategist at the Pentagon summer of 2001. He was writing every 4 years this defense review, which named China as the #1 threat. On 9/11, he was told to do a quick rewrite, deflate China, make terrorism the #1 threat. And they said, we've got 20 years to get it right on China. That was 25 years ago. We still don't have China right. Climate change, food security, the rise of the dictator authoritarian Vladimir Putin, our Zoom-like focus on counterterrorism blind us to these other threats that actually could be existential. And so we call for a widening the aperture and a wider definition of what threatens us.
That being said, there's a lot of discussion even on the House floor about our ability to manufacture weapons. We're short
We are.
missiles, correct? This asymmetric war we're losing currently, where are we with our missiles and what does that look like? Are we actually upping production? Are we going to NATO allies? I've heard we're talking to South Korea and others. I don't know if any of this is true, but do you have any knowledge of where we sit with our missiles and or what are we doing with additional production?
So the specific numbers in our inventory are classified for obvious reasons, but there's no way that this high tempo of the war is not diminishing supplies in worrisome some ways. As I think you said earlier, when you lob $1 million missile to bring down a $20,000 drone, who wins in that asymmetric battle? And Iran is winning. So The US has belatedly discovered drones, and Andy and I wrote about the rise of the
Okay.
drones in the book as well, and it's so interesting. I think the Wall Street Journal had a very clever essay last couple of days. We all recall when Trump and Vance humiliated President Zelensky of Ukraine in the Oval Office a year ago, and Trump said to him, "You don't have any cards. I hold all the cards. Be nice. Say thank you. You have no cards."
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
Not
cards.
playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
I'm very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're gambling
I'm the
with the
president
lives
of the
of
world.
billions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War III.
what you're
You're
speaking
gambling
about?
with
What are you
World
speaking
War
about?
III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
Guess who's holding all the aces right now when it comes to drone defense? Ukrainian experts are in probably every Persian Gulf capital today, advising them on how to defend against Iranian drones because Ukraine's been doing it for 3 years, and painful losses always. But Ukraine is the world's leading expert in drone and counter drone technology. So, how interesting who holds the cards now?
We don't have all of them. I think that's really the macro blunder is that if, there's different correspondents that I've listened to that I trust, and they said that things of superpowers historically would be able to go and launch a war like this and do it on their own, but not anymore. Obviously, we are, depending on what kind of data we're looking at. China and America are the two big military existence, and we look at that as that we're very powerful. Who else is? What else can we do with our mechanized kinetic wars? But we, even as a superpower, run out of things. And specific to the action systems, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz again, right? If we have to go and escort ships through that, you're looking at what we already talked about. There's 2,500 Marines already dispatched. There's going to be thousands more. There has to be, from what I'd read, you're looking at destroyers and different, very heavy military Navy ships and all of their crews and all of the people escorting boats back and forth. For how long? It's an indefinite period. That's also maybe why the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, requested $200 billion from additional dollars for this war. And people are just blanched at that number. And I think it's one of those things where, is that in part because we now need to go and have our military ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and we need to go and develop more missiles, and we need to go and recruit more soldiers? It seems like we're ramping up for a war that was going to end in 5 days. That it could be, I don't want to say it's a forever war yet, but it sure appears to be prolonged.
And that's one of the reasons that Joe Kent cited in his resignation letter that he supported Trump, who knew that wars in the Middle East detract from the problems here at home. That too, but think of all of the domestic programs that were cut by Trump and the Republicans in Congress because we didn't have money. I don't want to get into a culture war. That's not what True 30 is about. But you look at SNAP, you look at Voice of America, USAID, all these things that were cut to save money, and now 200 billion to help underwrite a war of choice that senior intelligence officials say was not to end a threat which wasn't even imminent. So
I,
it's and if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, things always go wrong. There's no military operation that can guarantee 100% safety of shipments to the Strait of Hormuz. All it takes is one giant tanker set ablaze, and that's that.
I told you, I promised you actually, that I wouldn't take you more than an hour, sir. So let me say we're at that hour. But what do you have any predictions, you and Andy, anyone else you've talked to, about maybe the best possible scenario of America finding an off ramp specific to this war with Iran?
I don't have one. They're all messy. And again, to quote Gorbachev again, if we want a stable peace to emerge, everybody has to leave the negotiating table believing they've won something. And as you said earlier, we have a hardliner now in charge of Iran. We have an extremely adamant president. So frankly, Joey, in the current situation today, I do not see any kind of realistic or reasonable compromise to end this war.
That's pretty reasonable in the sense that Donald Trump is not known for being reasonable. right? He's just not. He's someone he's a hardliner. He is a zero sum guy. He gets all his stuff. And if there's extra, you can have some, which is his history as a businessman as well as a politician. So I will leave it at that. And depending on your availability, sir, I would love to have you back in short order because sadly, I don't think this war is going anywhere. And I have lots of interest in this. And I want to make sure that we understand the nuance of war as opposed to what's coming from the left media or what's coming from the right media. And you, sir, are a wonderful source for that because you've never been partisan as a tenured and storied journalist with the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, someone that I look up to and have lots of respect for based on your tenure. And I would love to have you back to continue to have these conversations as things progress. Or
It's an honor. You're a great moderator, great questions. And as far as where I am in the spectrum, I mentioned earlier my wife, Johnny Cash, in the U.S. Army. What I learned from Johnny Cash is to walk the line. That's where you have to be. If you want to really inform people, shape the debate, you can't be left or right. You need to walk the line.
yeah.
And True 30 does that, Joey. It was an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Cheers.